Okay, yeah, so Marx's Revolution in Philosophy. I'm really excited to be discussing this, probably the most important subject for Marxists. I think it's good to start with the Communist Manifesto. The manifesto was published by Marx and Engels over 175 years ago in 1848. And ever since, the ideas of Karl Marx have been subject to a vicious campaign of lies and slander, and basically an unbroken attempt to try to expunge them from the historical record. But despite this, nobody, not even the most vicious slanderers of Marxism, can deny that his ideas dramatically changed the course of history. And I think this alone, in my opinion, is reason enough to study Marx's ideas, whether or not you agree or disagree. But for those of us who want to change society, well, there's an even more pressing reason to study Marxism. If you read Marx, I think it's impossible not to be struck by the astonishing breadth and depth of his work. Right? He made contributions in virtually every field, from philosophy to politics to art and science and even mathematics. But above all, what is most striking is the relevance of these ideas to today. Consider the manifesto. It was written over 175 years ago, but it's as fresh today as the day that it was written. If anything, it's probably more relevant today than it was then. I would encourage you, take a look at any book written by a bourgeois historian, a bourgeois economist from the same period. I don't think you're going to learn very much from it. These books are much more, not much more than a historical curiosity at this point. But if you read the manifesto, what you will find is an accurate description of the world, not as it was in 1848, but as the world is today. And even the defenders of capitalism are compelled to admit this. I have one example. In 2018, for the 200-year anniversary of Marx's birth, The Economist published an article titled "Rulers of the World, Read Karl Marx." And on his bicentenary, Marx's diagnosis of capitalism's flaws is surprisingly relevant. This is not an article that's praising Marx. It's actually an attempt to bury him, using all of the old, tired slanders we've all heard 1,000 times. Communism leads to dictatorship and famine, and everyone shares the same toothbrush, and so on and so forth. But they were reluctantly compelled to admit that the man was right about a few things, right? That capitalism has a tendency toward monopoly and stifling competition. That capitalism ultimately cuts stability out from underneath the working class and reduces people to basically an army of casual laborers who exist from one job to another, and so on and so forth. For these writers in The Economist, all of these things that Marx got right were just eerie coincidences or lucky guesses on Marx's part. And I have to say, if these were just lucky guesses, then Marx was probably the luckiest person in the world, since he was right about quite a lot. So how is this possible? Well, it doesn't just come down to luck, because Marx wasn't psychic, and he also, his work wasn't the product of some kind of intuitive spark of genius. Although I would argue I think Marx absolutely was a genius. But what allowed Marx and Engels to see so much further than their contemporaries, and most of the so-called educated people of today, was that of their method. This was their greatest accomplishment. And I think this is the key question for this discussion, is what makes Marx's theory of communism so important? And how can we use it to change society today? Because today, well, the word socialism, the word communism, are synonymous with the name of Marx. But the idea of socialism wasn't actually invented by Marx and Engels. It has a history that stretches back actually thousands of years. For example, during the Reformation in Germany in the 16th century, in addition, you'd probably heard of the Protestant reformers under Martin Luther, but there was also a more radical wing of the movement based on the peasantry, and they were called the Anabaptists. And they were already looking to abolish private property and create the conditions for a society where everything was held in common. You had an analogous movement of the levelers and the diggers in the English Revolution. And in 1516, the English writer Thomas More published his famous book Utopia, which actually described a communist society. Now, another perhaps surprising place where communist or socialist ideas can be found is actually more than 2,000 years ago. in an obscure, backward province of the Roman Empire that few people had ever heard of at the time. It was called Judea. And the Judean people had been involved in a long and bitter struggle to free themselves from the domination of the Romans. And this struggle took different forms at different times. You had the movement of the Zealots, which was an organized group of the poorest layers in Jewish society, former slaves, and so on. Basically that sought to end Roman rule through fanatical violence, actually. You had a whole series of assassinations of Roman officials and what were effectively terrorist uprisings against Roman rule that eventually culminated in the siege of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple in the year 70. But that wasn't all, because you also had another sect, a popular sect. It was called the Essenes. And they also wanted to escape Roman rule, though with maybe quieter methods. Instead of confronting the powers that be head on, they lived off the grid, if you like, forming primitive agricultural communes, where not just slavery, but also private property was abolished, and everything was shared in common. It was actually quite radical. Not just housing, but also food and even clothing was shared in common. They might have even shared toothbrushes. I'm not sure. But these two trends eventually fused. And they gave rise to a new religious trend, and that was the trend of early Christianity. So yeah, there's a new argument for the right wing for you. Christianity is where everyone shares the same toothbrush. But I think it can seem astonishing that one of the most reactionary social institutions ever to exist had its origins in one of the most extreme forms of communism. If you don't believe me, you can listen to this from the French historian Ernest Renan, who, by the way, was not a socialist, but he has this to say. He says, if you want to get a distinct idea of what the first Christian communities were, do not compare them to the parish congregations of our day. They were rather like local sections of the International Working Men's Association, in other words, the first international that was founded by Marx. So yeah, this was a revolutionary movement, and it proved so popular that the Roman state considered it better to try to co-opt it rather than fight it directly. And this is why they made it the official state religion and started the process of transforming it into the monstrous tool of repression that it is today. But you can still see the marks of this legacy. These primitive communes that they were actually written about. You can read about them in the Bible, in the Acts of the Apostles. And actually the Anabaptists, in the Protestant Reformation, took these writings and actually made them the inspiration for their own communist experiments. So yeah, who would have thought the Bible was a place where you could find dangerous communist propaganda? But yeah, what's so striking about this, reading the history of these struggles, is that despite the fact that they were waged more than 2,000 years ago in a completely different form, we're still discussing and debating the exact same ideas today. Right? Take, for example, the assassination of the United Health CEO by Luigi Mangione. This has millions of people asking if individual terrorism is an effective method of struggle. And how many of us have heard of people say that they want to give up on the rat race and go to the countryside and buy a hobby farm and live off the grid, right? Obviously, this one is only available to people with certain means. But basically, all of the ideas that you come across in the socialist movement today, especially the ones that are considered to be new and innovative ideas, are actually just rehashings of old, discredited ideas, and in some cases that are thousands of years old. And this is why theoretical education is so important, because if the movement isn't capable of learning from history, then it will ultimately be doomed to repeat it. In the modern period, the most developed socialist ideas before Marx have their origin in the Great French Revolution. So what was the French Revolution? Well, in the first place, it was one of the most magnificent and inspiring periods in human history. Starting in 1789, the Parisian masses rose up, and within a few short years, they overthrew every last vestige of feudal oppression and threw it into the fire of the revolution and laid the basis for a totally new form of society. And now, the ideological weapons for this revolutionary movement were first forged by the philosophes, that is, the great French materialist philosophers in the Enlightenment, in the period just before the revolution. These were thinkers like Rousseau, Diderot, Voltaire, and they made a thorough critique of the French feudal regime and all of the social ills that sprung from it. And for them, it was unacceptable to allow society to be blindly led, by religion or tradition or any other kind of external authority. the only acceptable authority was human reason. And anything that couldn't be justified by reason alone had to die. And they were unsparing in their attacks on everything. The king, the nobility, the church, basically everything had to go and be replaced by new social forms and institutions that were based on eternal truth and the inalienable rights of man. And this was a massive step forward. These ideas were the death knell for the monarchy and church rule all across Europe, and laid the basis for modern society. But at the same time, the French Revolution was ultimately a contradictory thing, because at the end of it all, the results of the revolution actually looked quite different to the lofty ideals of the philosophes. Instead of building a wonderful new egalitarian society, the revolution actually installed the rising merchant class, the bourgeoisie, into power, who set about reorganizing society into their own interests. And for the poor, well, yeah, perhaps you don't have to pay tithes or taxes to a feudal lord, but now you're compelled to work for meager wages by a capitalist boss. And actually, in some cases, the feudal dues weren't actually abolished after all. They were just simply transferred to a capitalist owner who continued to collect the rents and the tithes and all the rest of it. So yeah, in other words, for the masses who had sacrificed so much in the revolution, in the end, they merely ended up substituting one form of oppression for another. And France, perhaps a few decades after the revolution, came to look very similar to society today. A mass of workers getting ever poorer, while the rich would live idle lives of luxury, engaging in speculation and all of the rest of it. So yeah, this was obviously a bitter disappointment for many. And eventually, a new generation of philosophers and social theorists arose and tried to give a theoretical expression to this disappointment and find a way forward. And these were the great Utopian socialists. Engels has written much about these people. And these thinkers were ruthless in their criticisms of this so-called new order based on reason. And they put forward their own ideas about what a new form of society could look like. And I have to say, some of these ideas were well ahead of their time. For example, you had Saint-Simon. He talked about planning industry in order to develop the economy and technology to the point that want would be eliminated and the state would become redundant. You also had Fourier, and he developed a theory of stages in social development, where capitalist society, what he called civilization, was just one of these stages, which would eventually be replaced by another, which was socialism. Yeah, these are very modern ideas. These thinkers had a massive influence on Marx and the other socialists at the time. Unlike the postmodernist philosophers today, who reject everything, all of the ideas that came before them, Marx and Engels paid homage to these great thinkers and actually incorporated the best of their ideas into their own theory. But of course, these ideas also had their limitations. In the first place, the Utopian socialists were not revolutionaries. Despite some of these ideas, which were profoundly materialist and I would say even dialectical, they remained utopian because they completely rejected the class struggle. Saint-Simon, for example, explicitly said that the purpose of his program was to avoid class struggle, and that the people who were to plan the economy were the capitalists on behalf of the workers. Whereas for Fourier, the question of class struggle was actually irrelevant, because for him, the idea was to travel to the United States and found colonies where they could live together along socialist principles, which again is a revival of this old idea of the agricultural communes, which had already been tried, actually more than once in history. But they had another weakness, and this is that they based themselves on the same reasoning of the Enlightenment philosophers. That is to say, they were trying to create an ideal society based on reason. And for them, the reason why the French Revolution had failed was that the architects of the new society had simply failed to understand it correctly. And that all that was needed was to conceive of a better and a more rational form of society. And that once that had been discovered and put into practice, all of humanity's problems would be solved. Now ultimately for the Utopians, socialism was a good idea, right? It was something morally desirable, and ultimately what we needed to do was convince everybody of this idea through systematic preaching, right? And this idea is basically the dominant idea of socialism that exists in the movement today, actually. It reduces the whole question of socialism to a kind of historical accident, right? Because if they were right, then socialism could have been brought into being several thousand years ago, if only someone had thought of it, right? And if that was the case, well, I suppose humanity would have been saved quite a bit of trouble. But yeah, as Engels explained, ultimately all of the ideas of the utopians were doomed to failure, because none of these thinkers could really understand the underlying material conditions that gave rise to one or another form of society. So what they were unable to really explain, where capitalism had come from, or what kind of social forces existed that would be capable of changing society. But also, each one of these thinkers had a necessarily limited viewpoint. They were limited by the knowledge of their age, but they were also limited by the amount of subjective knowledge that they had in their own minds, which of course was different for each person. Each person knew different things. So ultimately, each of these utopias that they invented kind of differed from one another. And as they would debate each other, the sharp edges of each of their theories would kind of rub off until all that was left was like the lowest common denominator, which was inevitably this kind of eclectic hodgepodge of ideas. Which is basically, again, the situation that we have today, right? Most people, you talk about socialism, they kind of have a vague idea of what it is, but it's a little different for everybody, right? For some people, it's universal health care. For other people, it means taxing the rich. For some people, it's what they have in Sweden, right? And many of these ideas actually end up contradicting each other if you really press to the root of it. So yeah, things had reached a dead end. And in order to move forward, the movement had to go through a process of political clarification, which I would add, again, this is the exact same task that's facing the movement today. So now in Germany, at around the same time, there was another revolution that was taking place. It was about a quieter revolution, but it was just as important. And this was a revolution in philosophy, which culminated in the work of Hegel. And this was the world into which Karl Marx was born in 1818 in Trier, which at the time was part of Rhenish Prussia. His father was a lawyer. His family was, comfortably well off. They weren't particularly revolutionary in their outlook. And after leaving school in Trier, Marx went on to university, first in Bonn and later in Berlin, where he read law and eventually majored in history and philosophy. And this is where Marx first came into contact with Hegel's philosophy. And I have to say, he didn't have an easy time of it. Hegel is famously dense and difficult to read. And in one letter, Marx even complained about what he called the rocky melody of his writing. Marx found him as difficult to read as the rest of us, I guess. In fact, Lenin actually once said that reading Hegel was perhaps the best means of getting a headache. But yeah, Marx was, if nothing else, determined. This is something that characterized Marx for his whole life. He always had a deep need to understand the world around him and was determined to overcome whatever obstacles were in front of him to achieve that understanding. So eventually, during a period of illness, he set himself the task of reading all of Hegel, which is a monumental task, actually, and it totally changed his life. What is it in Hegel that Marx found so profound? Hegel developed what is known as the dialectical mode of reasoning. And this isn't something that Hegel invented, right? It actually originated in ancient Greece. The word dialectic is itself derived from the ancient Greek, and it means to discuss. And originally, it referred to the art of discussion, of the kind that you would find in the Socratic dialogues, which are preserved today in the writings of Plato. And the idea is this: through a rigorous process of argument, starting with a thesis, and then counterposing to that an antithesis, that is a contradictory point of view. And through the debate that follows, you try to examine the question from all sides, and eventually the debaters arrive at a synthesis, which is a higher form of understanding. And this doesn't necessarily mean that both sides of the argument have to reach an agreement, but it's in the process of developing the discussion that both people come to a deeper understanding of the question, and the discussion moves from a lower to a higher level. So this is the dialectic of discussion in its classical form. But the other Greek philosophers, they developed on this idea, and they took the principle of development through contradiction, and they applied it to everything. They actually made it the basic principle governing everything in nature. So what does this mean? It's the idea that all things are interconnected and are going through a constant process of change and development through contradiction. That all things ultimately contain their opposite, and eventually become transformed into their opposite through this process of development and change. So yeah, this can seem like an abstract idea at first glance. What does this mean? Well, take any kind of opposite, right? East and West, for example. They seem like irreconcilable opposites, but on closer observation, they're actually interconnected. Because if you travel far enough east, well, you actually end up going west, and vice versa. And contradictions like this are actually present everywhere. Up is down, night becomes day, and so on. Life and death actually also appear to be mutually exclusive opposites, but in reality, our life actually contains our death because our cells contain essentially pre-programmed processes that determine our finite lifespan. And this process begins actually from the moment that we are born. From that moment, we already begin to die. And even motion itself is a contradiction, because the very idea of motion means that you're in two places at the same time, which the philosopher Zeno illustrated in his famous paradoxes. And the first, I would say, real dialectical philosopher in ancient Greece was Heraclitus, who earned himself the name Heraclitus the Dark because his contemporaries found him so obscure. And not much of his work survives today. All we have left is, a series of very short but profound aphorisms, such as this. No man ever steps into the same stream twice, for it's not the same stream, and he's not the same man. And another one that I enjoy quite a bit. Some things stay the same only by changing. This is very profound. What does this mean? Well, an example. In order to survive, every animal needs to constantly bring in nutrients, oxygen, and so on, and excrete waste. And all of our cells are constantly undergoing a process of division and death and regeneration. So we're constantly changing. And in fact, there's only one point in our lives when we stop changing, and that's when we cease to exist, right? When we die. So this is a very profound truth about the nature of life itself. Some things stay the same only by changing. Modern science has given us even more profound examples of contradictory development. There's many famous examples. One is the nature of light, right? The question of whether light was a particle or a wave was a debate that raged in science for centuries, actually. And finally, in the 20th century, experimental evidence finally settled this question. What was the result? Well, according to the data, neither of these propositions are either true or false, right? Some tests show light to be radiant energy, others show it to be discrete units of matter, right? This is a profoundly dialectical truth about this contradictory phenomenon. So yeah, dialectical reasoning teaches us that nothing is pure or fixed or self-contained, and that all things are interconnected and in a constant process of what Hegel calls becoming. In other words, of development and evolution, of coming into being and passing away. And at first sight, I think these ideas can seem very difficult or very abstract. But in reality, this is a very natural way of looking at the world. Engels even wrote this is one of the earliest and most primitive ways of looking at the world, because when people look at some complex phenomenon, whether that's something that they find in the natural world or in history, the tendency is actually to first see the transformations and the motions, right? See all of the movements taking place in this system rather than the individual discrete things that move. But it's also an inherently scientific and a profoundly revolutionary way of looking at the world. The Russian writer Alexander Herzl wrote that dialectics is the algebra of revolution, because it teaches us to see the inevitable emergence of the new from the old, and that dialectics boldly announces all that exists deserves to perish, in the words of Hegel. And the result of this destructive process isn't simply reduction to nothingness, but to new, higher forms that arise out of the process of development. And it's precisely because of this revolutionary character that the dialectical mode of thinking has been received by the ruling classes throughout all of history, actually, with suspicion and usually outright hostility. So after the ancient world collapsed, all of these great dialectical insights of the Greek philosophers were buried. For some of you, if any of you have studied philosophy in school, you'll probably be familiar with Aristotle, who was the inventor of formal logic. But he also wrote extensively about dialectics. In fact, he wrote a systematic account of the laws of dialectics in his work, The Organon. And Yeah, his dialectic was actually buried by the rising Catholic Church, who were busy developing their own world outlook. Obviously, you're probably familiar with this, right? They placed the Earth at the center of the system, where heavenly spheres kind of orbit the Earth around and around forever in perfect harmony. And obviously, at the very center of the system was the Catholic Church itself. And I think they correctly understood, well, that a mode of thinking that claims that everything that exists in the universe will eventually die and be transformed into something new was a mortal threat to their class interests. So the version of Aristotle's work that was handed down through the church dogma in the Middle Ages excluded any mention of the dialectic, and all that remained was this lifeless formal logic. And by the time of the Renaissance, when science and philosophy finally began to develop freshly outside of the crushing domination of the church, all of these dialectical insights of the Greeks had largely been forgotten. And this was reinforced by the development of science itself, because at the time, the main task of science was actually to kind of systematize and catalog everything, right? This is one of the most important things that science needs to do before it can make conclusions, right, is to catalog, right? For example, Linnaeus, who was the great systematizer of biology, his great service to humanity was to carry out this painstaking process of organizing and classifying every living species into a big hierarchy of orders based on shared physical characteristics. And the system of taxonomy that's used in biology today actually comes to us from Linnaeus. But this necessary work of systematizing and categorizing and arranging things into categories led to the reinforcement of these rigid habits of thought, right? Instead of seeing everything as connected, things started to be seen as separate and opposed to each other permanently and kind of lifeless, almost like a dead butterfly that you've pinned down and displayed behind glass. This is the world of formal logic, right? A is equal to A, and not A cannot be equal to A, and so on. And yeah, while formal logic is undoubtedly correct, and it has its place, it can only understand things when they're fixed and rigidly opposed to one another. And Trotsky likened the difference between formal logic and dialectics to that between a photograph and a video. Obviously, the video does not negate the existence of the photograph, but the video is capable of showing reality in a much more dynamic way, as part of its life process, if you like. But yeah, the dominant philosophy in the Western world today, in particular, the philosophy of empiricism, is a product of this kind of thinking. The empirical philosophers, they said, well, contradiction doesn't exist in the real world. Contradiction can only exist in logic. And if it exists in logic, if you've made a contradiction in your mind, well, that actually means you've made a mistake, right? For them, yeah, opposites are always mutually exclusive. And to consider, yeah, that something could turn into its opposite, well, this is a heresy, and still is in many philosophical circles, actually. Yeah, this is the philosophy of so-called sound common sense. And in everyday life, yeah, common sense works just fine, right? Most people don't need to adopt a consistently or a consciously dialectical outlook just to get on in your daily life, although I would argue there are definitely cases where it's useful even here. But yeah, common sense has its limits. It's sufficient to remember that from the perspective of common sense, the Earth appears to be flat. Yeah, but it's. I think the limits are perhaps most obvious in science, which has the benefit of observing a broad range of view phenomena over a long period of time, where these kinds of transformations make themselves evident. But even in daily life, capitalism ultimately forces a dialectical outlook onto ordinary working people, right? Because think about it. Yeah, capitalism has the appearance of stability, but underneath the surface, there's all of these contradictions that are piling up in the economy. And then one day, all at once, that stability gives way to crisis. And maybe the factory job that you've had for your whole life disappears, or the only hospital in the town that you live in closes, and suddenly people are forced to reckon with the reality of change in a very big way. Yeah, so Hegel's greatest achievement was to restore the dialectic to its proper place in philosophy. And he also applied it to the study of history, which for the first time opened the road to the study of history on a scientific basis. And most historians still have this kind of empirical, narrow, one-sided habit, which is of seeing historical events or personalities as totally separate from each other. And from this point of view, history just looks like a series of accidents or endless violence, or as Henry Ford aptly remarked, just one damn thing after another. Yeah, and Hegel's view was the opposite, right? That all of history, natural history and human history, is part of a constant process of change, where everything is interconnected and constantly coming into being and passing away. And it's only when history is conceived of in this way that it's actually possible to discover what is the inner logical thread that governs history. Because, yeah, history is not just a series of disconnected events. History is actually governed by laws, just like every other domain of nature and science. Why should it be that all of the phenomena in the universe, from the largest galaxies all the way down to the smallest subatomic particles, are governed by laws that human beings can discover, but for some reason our own history is not, right? A proposition like this is contrary to all of science. But this is precisely what Marx did. He discovered the fundamental laws of history by adopting Hegel's dialectic in the first place, but also by putting it on a sound scientific, that is to say, a materialist basis. So what is this? What is this word materialism? Well, in a philosophical sense, materialism simply means an outlook that explains that there's only one material world, that there's no heaven and no hell, and that the universe was not created by any kind of supernatural being. So therefore, all of the dialectical contradictions that we see in the world aren't random, they're not externally imposed, that everything has its own kind of internal logic that can only be discovered by immersing oneself in the subject matter. You have to immerse yourself in reality as it presents itself to us, and not rely on abstract principles that are imposed upon reality by some kind of God or a world spirit, or whatever you want to call it, which is ultimately what Hegel believed. Armed with this new philosophical outlook, which they called dialectical materialism, Marx and Engels took up a very detailed and a very thorough study of all of past history and to try and uncover what these laws are. And the conclusion that they came to is that the fundamental motor force in history is the class struggle. That is to say, throughout all of history, excluding the early history of primitive humanity, human beings have been divided up into classes, according to the relationship that they have with the way that things are produced and exchanged in that society, right? Classes like freeman and slave, or lord and serf, and so on. In other words, oppressor and oppressed. And that these classes were engaged in a constant struggle to try to shape society in their own interests, and that each one of these struggles ultimately ends either in the reconstitution of society on the basis of a new revolutionary class that comes to power, or, if this class fails in its historic task, well, the ultimate destruction of that kind of society. And that the politics, the ideological struggles that take place in society are ultimately reflections of these great class battles. And I guess you could also say, Marx and Engels were very lucky to be living at the time that they did, because by the time that they began their studies, they had important new material to work with. By the early 1830s, the modern working class was first beginning to emerge onto the scene of history. For example, you had the first ever strike by silk weavers in France in the 1830s, and not long after that, you had the first national working class movement in England, which was the Chartist movement. And this historical experience is what led Marx to conclude that the working class, due to their position in society, that they are the class that has both the ability and the consciousness necessary to transform society in their own interests. And I think you have to appreciate, despite the genius ideas of the Utopians that came before them, it actually would have been impossible for this idea to occur to them because, well, they were active and writing maybe 30 years or so before this, at a time when the working class was just coming into being. Right? And barely existed as a class, right? You can hardly expect them to come to the conclusion that the working class will lead the socialist revolution when the working class doesn't exist. So this method also solved the secret of the French Revolution, right? How was it that a movement that was so revolutionary and based on the most radical ideas only ended up exchanging one form of oppression for another? Well, in the end, it was because the working class was only just coming into existence. It was too weak to be able to set its stamp on the course of events. And there were communist trends in the movement, but they were unable to play the leading role due to the class contradictions, or the class conditions, rather, of the time. And they also explained that the basis of the ideas of the French materialists were ultimately rooted in the needs and the interests of the rising bourgeoisie. because they needed, the free development of science, trade, and so on, to develop industry, to strengthen their social position, and ultimately undermine the rule of the feudal nobility. And the writings of the great French materialist philosophers were ultimately a reflection of this need. So these discoveries were the ideological death knell for capitalism. And this is the real reason why Marxist theories are received with such hatred by the ruling class today. Because what do they prove? They prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that capitalism, far from being some kind of eternal form of society, no, it has an expiry date. And just like human beings are fated to die as a consequence of our biological composition, well, capitalism too produces the seeds of its own destruction in the form of the working class, or capitalism's own gravediggers, to use this wonderful expression from the Communist Manifesto. And they showed, that thanks to capitalist development, all of the necessary elements are in place, highly developed industry, science and technique, to move to a higher form of society where all of the means of production are owned and controlled in common. And class oppression and exploitation is a thing of the past. And with these discoveries, socialism became a science. And this is, socialism is no longer something that has to be invented in the brain of a genius, but something that emerges out of the conditions of society. And it's this conception that we fight for in the movement today. There's so much more that could be said about these ideas, and I don't have enough time to go into them in the detail that I wish I could. But if my hope is, I've encouraged some of you to take up a thorough study of these ideas for yourselves, right? Because above all, if there's one thing that I hope people take away from this, it's the essential role that theory plays in the struggle to change society. Engels once commented that the class struggle is not waged on two fronts, not just on the political and the economic front, but also on the theoretical front. And that actually the theoretical front is far from the least important in the struggle. One word of warning. You can find many, many, many works that are written about Marxism. In reality, most of these books are against Marxism, but few of them actually admit it. And there's a couple ways that they do this. On the one hand, you have the books written by the defenders of capitalism about Marx. And then the classic method, is to set up a straw man, create these kind of spurious arguments that have nothing to do with Marxism, present them as the ideas of Marx, and then you can, knock them down and defeat them. On the other hand, and I'd say this is maybe the more pernicious version, you have the interpretations, right? Works that go to great lengths to tell us what Marx really meant, when in reality, they proceed to distort Marx's ideas beyond all recognition. This is the method of so many of the so-called Marxist academics. So how do you actually understand what Marx meant? Well, it's quite easy. Read Marx for yourself. Some people will tell you, Marx's works are very difficult to read. I don't think this is actually true. Marx and Engels, they wrote for working class people, right? Not for clever academics, as some people like to imagine. No, they wanted to make themselves understood by ordinary people. But having said this, Marx also didn't believe in dumbing down his ideas. In other words, talking to workers like they're little children. Because, the reality is, this is the voice of middle class, clever academics who actually think that workers are stupid. Nothing could be further from the truth, right? Workers want to understand. They want to understand the world around them. And ultimately, every worker knows there's nothing worth having in life is achieved without a struggle. So to study Marx's writings with the necessary attention, yes, it will require a certain amount of work, but I would say that the rewards merit such an effort. I would say every working class person, every young person, above all, anybody who wants to change society, has to make it their duty to make a thorough study of Marx's writings, and above all, to master the method of Marx. I think this isn't an academic exercise, because Marx's ideas are ultimately, above all, a guide to action. It's not just a series of tomes that you can recite by rote or pick out a few quotes here and there and then, oh yes, I know Marxism. No, it's a living method for understanding the world so that we can change it. You'll often find people in the movement who kind of like to poo-poo on theory, right? Especially people who aspire to lead these movements. I'm thinking of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, for example. She said once that reading theory is bougie, and that what is needed is action, right? Based, of course, on the lowest common denominator. I think for her, this is totally dishonest, right? She's happy for the workers to understand nothing so that they'll believe anything, right? But there are also genuine people in the movement who have this idea. I've talked to people before, and they'll say things like, oh, yes, I agree with you guys, but I don't think I need to read Marx or Lenin. Well, what do we say to this? Well, look, we need to understand how society works. And an understanding that's based on that simple common sense, right? I.e., an understanding that's based on what's immediately around you. That's not going to cut it, especially when you're dealing with something as complex as society or history. Because on the surface of things, things can seem very stable, uncomplicated, uncontradictory. And this has actually led a lot of people to pessimism and despair, right? It's easy to look at the world as it is and say, oh, no one is doing anything. The working class will never revolt. They're too right-wing, and so on and so forth. Right? How many times have we heard this argument? And then suddenly one day, everything seems to change out of nowhere. Right? We're seeing this right now with the magnificent Gen Z revolutions that have been sweeping the globe in one country after another, from Indonesia to Nepal to Madagascar, and on and on and on. And also the magnificent general strike for Gaza in Italy, where more than 2 million people took to the streets and shut society down, right? And this in a country where the prime minister is right-wing, right? For so long, so many people on the left would lament about Italy, oh, it's so right-wing, and so on and so forth. And yet these same Italians are now shutting down society for Palestine and actually showing the way forward for the rest of the international working class. How can this be explained? Actually, you can't explain it with just common sense. You actually need dialectical logic to explain phenomena like this. And this is the explanation. In normal periods, working class people live their lives. They go to work, they spend time with their families, and all of the other normal things that people do. Maybe they don't think too much about politics. But underneath the surface, there's a revolutionary process that's taking place. The crisis of capitalism is getting deeper and deeper. And to maintain economic stability, the ruling class is forced to make cuts and austerity. Or perhaps it's a question of oppression or racism or the genocide in Palestine or all of the other social ills that exist under capitalism. And all of these things start to pile up. And there's this gradual accumulation of anger that builds up over a period of years and decades. And this is a contradiction. It's a tension between form and content, right? And then at a certain point, all of this anger boils over all at once. And this quantitative accumulation of anger gives rise to a qualitative change in the situation. This is how working class consciousness develops, right? For long periods, it can lag behind events as people kind of tune out politics and try to get on with their lives. But in certain moments, under the hammer blow of events, consciousness catches up with a bang. And this is why dialectical logic is so important for revolutionaries. Because if you don't understand this process, if you think that these changes are going to happen gradually, or that every day the workers are going to get slightly more radical, or every day the Revolutionary Party is going to get a little bit bigger, and so on, actually you're bound to end up demoralized because this is not actually how change works, right? It's also impossible to understand the nature of society itself, right? Take China, for example, a wonderfully contradictory phenomenon. Here you have a country that was forged in one of the greatest revolutions in history, right? The Chinese Revolution of 1949. And yet, what is China today? If you look at the surface of things, you have the Communist Party in power, and living conditions for Chinese people have been improving for the past few decades. Well, you could reasonably look at these surface phenomena and conclude, oh yes, China is a socialist country. But beneath the surface, you're going to find a very different picture. Right? The vast majority of production is in private hands. And where the state plays a role, they actually help to facilitate the transfer of more and more wealth into the hands of the Chinese bourgeoisie. And perhaps most importantly, they act in a classically imperialist manner on the world stage. Well, how could this happen? It's quite simple, actually. You look at the Soviet Union in the 1990s. In the 90s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And the Soviet bureaucracy succeeded in what they had been hoping to do for some time, which is to transform themselves into a ruling class and become owners of private property themselves. But this didn't happen without a struggle on the part of the working class. The working class in the Soviet Union actually tried to resist this transformation. Now, the ruling class in China Well, they watched this happen. Excuse me, the bureaucracy in China watched this happen. And they wanted to take the same path, but they had learned the lessons from the USSR. So instead, they maintained the outward forms of the communist regime, the bureaucratized Communist Party and all the rest of it, and gradually shifted more and more of the economy into private hands behind the scenes. Right? This is an enormously contradictory development, but it can't be understood unless we learn to take things as they are, right? To probe things deeply and learn to analyze things in their full development through history, not just on the surface in an empirical manner. Yeah, I'm going on for some time. I'll end on this point. Do we need philosophy? Well, a lot of people, I'd say, especially the poor souls who've had the misfortune of taking philosophy classes in school, would probably answer this question in the negative, right? If your only exposure to philosophy is this kind of tedious, barren, hair-splitting and the repetition that there is no truth, right? The stuff that passes for philosophy in the universities, well, to be honest, I don't think I would want anything to do with it either. But for a long time, yeah, philosophy meant something different. In ancient Greek, the word actually means love of wisdom. And Heraclitus took this a step further and said, wisdom is to speak the truth and act in keeping with its nature. The greatest thinkers of human history not only were capable of producing powerful insights into the nature of reality, but they also saw their ideas as sharp weapons in the struggle to change society. Actually, the capitalist class, the bourgeoisie, they once aspired to this. They took up the revolutionary scientific ideas of the French materialists in their struggle against the old feudal regimes. But today it's actually the opposite. They obscure the truth because today they see in the truth their own destruction. And this is the real reason why we need philosophy. Lenin once said, Marxism is omnipotent because it is true. And this is correct, it's a weapon in the class struggle. And our task as communists today is to take up this weapon and follow in the footsteps of those great revolutionaries that came before us, to seek truth, face reality in the face, and chart our course based entirely on the demands of that truth, to overcome every barrier, and to make unflinching sacrifices in the struggle to realize the new world that's fighting to be born from within the old. It's not enough to say Marx was right. This is a weapon, and we have to learn to use it. Thank you.